Welcome, grade 12 scholars. It's Miss Novak, and we are entering into week 7, lesson 30 of your ELA Distance Learning. What can you expect from these videos? First and foremost, variety, especially during this week, because we're going to be moving into a study of poetry. So each lesson is going to have a very different feel than lessons before. I'll provide you with a list of materials and resources. Make sure to move through a brief overview of the different lesson components. I'll even model one of the lesson components, especially as it relates to writing and/or the first read or close read components of the lesson. And of course, we'll move through a preview of the next day's learning. This is a shortened week for us, 4 days versus 5. That's 80% of what we're used to. Well, we will be spending our time this week studying the poem Escape from the Old Country by Adrian Sue. Our video today is ELA G12W7L30, and today's task is for us to complete a first read and to make connections to the text. Let's move through a few quick reminders before we engage in today's lesson. First, carve out that time not only for your independent reading, but also to share your learning with someone else. It will help solidify the learning of the lesson for you. Trust me on this. Next, engage in fluency practice. Kind of cool this week because we're doing it with a poem. Make sure that you review the directions for clarity if you need to. Lastly, and as mentioned, it's so important to carve out that 20 minutes for independent reading as well. Hopefully you found something that you lose track of time with. It's my hope for you. You ready for today's pictogram puzzle? I am. I already figured it out, but that's besides the point. Take about 15 seconds to look at this image and think about what words or phrases this image conjures up. If you need to pause the video, like I did my first time, go ahead and do so now. The solution is freebies. Get it? There's no price to them. There's a few of them. Freebies. I always get excited for a freebie. Samples, that kind of thing. All right, let's get into our learning. Materials and resources that you'll need for today's lesson. Well, first, our lesson is on page 95, inside of our grade 12 learning packets. Our note catcher, not surprisingly, on page 96. The text, just on page 94. Remember, we're reading one single poem this week. And a pencil, pen, or something to write with. Can I please suggest the use of a highlighter here, especially as we move into the different activities for each day. Just helps us keep things straight. Just to prime our thinking for this lesson and this week, note that we'll be reading one poem by Adrian Sue entitled Escape from the Old Country. Our essential question will be top of mind. What does it mean to call a place home? I think you'll feel that this one really resonates with this particular text. And our guiding questions. What makes a place important enough to write about? And the next one, in what ways is home both a place and state of mind? This one also is highly relevant to this poem. Keep these in mind as we begin our learning. Our learning target for today reads, I can read a poem and connect its message with a movie, song, or piece of art. A little bit different today. I think we'll like it. Let's get ready. Our overview of learning. Today we'll start by learning about the author of Escape from the Old Country, and then we'll do a first read of the poem. Our first read might take us a little while because the poem is rather dense. After that, you will think and write about what the poem reminds you of. Your discussion today will be about your first impression of the poem and what you think the author's message is. You'll be writing a response to a prompt that asks you to make that connection to a movie, song, or piece of art just to solidify your thinking and to get you further engaged in the message of the poem. Let's first start by reading a little bit of background about the author and about the context of the poem. I'm going to read directly from my grade 12 packet if you don't mind, and I suggest that you follow along. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of insight of what I gained from these two very short paragraphs. Let's get started. Adrian Sue, born 1967, was raised in Atlanta, Georgia. She graduated from Radcliffe College at Harvard University and received a Master of Fine Arts from the University of Virginia. She has published 3 books of poetry and teaches at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. She says that writing goes best for me when it's woven into everyday life. Interesting. A couple of items that I gathered from that short paragraph. That she was raised in America and has graduated from college and graduate school. Not too shabby to attend Harvard either. She's working as a college professor. I wonder what experiences she drew from when writing this poem, especially because she wants her writing situated in everyday life. Right? Now let's read a little bit of the background of the poem here. Again, in our grade 12 packets. Escape from the Old Country is a poem from Sue's collection Sanctuary, published in 2006. It is about being the child of parents who immigrated to the United States from China. Like much of Sue's work, the poem illuminates what it means to be a member of a community, whether it be a family, a neighborhood, or an ethnic group. What I gained from this short descriptor, this gives me more insight as to what to expect from the poem. This makes me think of another text we read in this unit, Back to My Own Country, similar titles there, in which the author was also the child of immigrant parents. So I'm able to forge a connection back to a text that we previously read, and I have a context and a purpose for reading, just after reading these 2 small paragraphs. Again, I can't reinforce that practice enough. Let's get ready to launch into our first read. Now it's your turn. I'd like you to launch into a first read of the poem. As you read, annotate the text using the guidance here and on your lesson plan. We're going a little bit deeper here in our first reads because, in fact, this is a poem. So you're still underlining words or phrases or sentences that seem particularly important or that stand out to you. You're taking notes about the feelings that the poem captures and conveys, drawing a box around unfamiliar words, and writing down any reactions that you have or questions you have in the margins. As you can see, I went a little bit crazy on my first read. I had to because there's so much there. So pause the video at this point, and if you haven't already looked into the Bounce Pages app, you might want to, because then you can have the text read out loud to you as you're doing your first read. Take some time to complete this task now. So before we move on to our next lesson component, I really can't stress enough the importance of writing in the margins and really connecting with the text, even on this first read. So let me show you a few lines that I lifted up and then my interpretation of these lines. Starting with line 5. Spent the babysitting money on novels, shoes, and movies. Yet the neighborhood stayed empty. It had nothing to do with a journey not undertaken. Interesting. I see here that the author buys items that she thinks will help her assimilate into American culture, right? New shoes, novels, trying to be on the up and up of the latest movies that have been released. And yet she still feels isolated. Remember this undercurrent, this theme of the poem of belonging to a group or entity. I see that here. She realizes that she's still tied to her culture even though she was born in America. So I think she's looking at her identity and really looking at it from a holistic standpoint. She might not realize it, but these are the types of questions that she's asking herself. Take some time to reflect on your first read. Share it with a friend if you'd like, before we move on to exploring the additional tasks found in this lesson. For the rest of this lesson, you will be thinking, talking, and writing about the text. First, I'd like you to think about a movie, song, or piece of art that the poem may have reminded you of. As you think, make some notes in the margins of the note catcher. Believe it or not, this was a pretty tough task for me to complete here. I had to actually go back because artwork doesn't necessarily pop into my mind, or movies necessarily either. So I had to think about the concept of isolation and belonging to a family and immigration and identity and come up with some answers like that. I even had to Google a little bit as well to conjure up some images and artwork that relates to identity. Next, I'd like you to think about the conversations that you'll have with a family member or a friend. And think about your first impression of the poem and what you think the author's message is. It's especially interesting to trade this conversation and your insights with someone who also has read the poem as well, perhaps in your online lesson. Finally, use your learnings from your conversation to expand on your thoughts from before. Write a 3 to 5 sentence response about how this poem connects to a movie, song, or piece of artwork. Feel free, and I encourage you to use evidence from the text in your response. Take some time to complete these tasks now. As always, if you have any questions about this lesson or about the poem or celebrations of your learning, feel free to reach out to your teacher using the following format: first name, their last name at DetroitK12.org. I'm sure they're excited to launch into the study of poetry, and they would be really excited to hear from you. As promised, your learning target for tomorrow. In tomorrow's lesson, you'll be reading a poem and answering questions about specific details from the text, of course. Again, this poem is really meaty. There's a lot of insight that the author captures. So it'll be really important to pay attention to not only specific stanzas of the poem, but actually the words themselves individually. Let's get ready for that. Thank you so much for engaging and learning with me today. Here's a few quick reminders before we close up shop. First one, don't forget to talk about your learning with someone. We're talking about really interesting things here, especially as it relates to the poem. We're talking about identity and heritage and making connections to music and songs and artwork. Those are really cool topics of conversation if you ask me. Next, read for 20 minutes and document your activity in your reading log. There's a small little box there for notes and questions about the text. I highly recommend that you use it. It's almost like a record of your learning. You can go back and actually answer those questions. And lastly, engage in your fluency practice. Directions are found in the first couple of pages of your packet. We'll see you tomorrow.